It's 1943. The war, a distant roar across the Atlantic, suddenly landed on Main Street, USA. Not with bombs, not with invading armies, but with trains. Long, dark trains pulling into sleepy American towns, carrying an unimaginable cargo. Thousands of them, German soldiers, prisoners of war stepping onto American soil. They weren't the caricatures of propaganda posters, not the snarling demons. They were young men, scared, disoriented, wearing the enemy's uniform, and they were here. Imagine the silence, the disbelief. Your son is fighting in Normandy, or shivering in the Ardennes, facing these very uniforms. And now they're here, in your backyard. Confined to hastily constructed camps, yes, but undeniably present. A palpable tension hung in the air, thick with mistrust. Cultural barriers felt like concrete walls. The heavy weight of wartime animosity pressed down on every single soul. These German soldiers, many barely out of their teens, were equally wary. Plucked from the hellish battlefields of Europe, dropped into a foreign land. They were surrounded by people they were taught to despise, unsure of their fate. Their eyes met the suspicious stares of townsfolk, a silent, volatile exchange across an invisible line of war. But what happened next defies all logic. It wasn't through grand diplomatic efforts. It wasn't military directives. It was something far more radical. A series of profound human gestures began to bridge this chasm of fear. What happens next changes everything. Local church congregations, driven by deeply held faith and an innate sense of human decency, extended an olive branch. A simple, impossible invitation. Come, worship with us. This wasn't just an offer of a pew. It was an offer of shared humanity, a moment to set aside uniforms, to shed ideologies, to recognize a common spirit beneath the enemy's cloth. Picture the scene. German soldiers, under guard, walking into small-town American churches. Their presence, a stark, jarring contrast to the familiar faces of the local community. The hushed murmurs, the uneasy glances. Every local eye tracked their movement. These were the men whose nation was at war with theirs. Yet here they sat, rows apart, perhaps, but under the same roof, breathing the same air, listening to the same hymns, the air thick with unspoken questions. Could forgiveness even exist in wartime? Could shared faith truly transcend the deepest divides? For these American towns, the enemy wasn't some distant abstraction anymore. He was Private Muller, sitting 3 rows ahead. He was Corporal Schmidt, his uniform faded, his eyes reflecting a weariness beyond his years. This was the raw, unfiltered reality, and for the POWs, it was equally disorienting. They expected hostility. They anticipated scorn. Instead, they found an invitation. The initial awkwardness was a physical weight. You could feel it in the strained silence before the sermon. You could see it in the hesitant glances exchanged. But then a hymn would begin. A familiar melody, perhaps, translated from their own language, a shared prayer, and for a fleeting moment the uniforms blurred, the lines softened. The sheer audacity of the gesture hung in the air, a silent question. What if we're more alike than we are different? The belief was simple. They were the enemy. Unquestionably, irredeemably. That was the narrative fed by every newsreel, every radio broadcast, every letter from the front. But then, reality walked into a Sunday service. Reality had a name. Reality had a story, even if unspoken, and this reality began to chip away at the hardened walls of wartime ideology. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, almost imperceptible erosion. Consider the data. Over 425,000 German POWs were eventually held in nearly 500 camps across 46 states. A staggering number. Far from the battlefields, these men became an unexpected part of the American landscape. And in towns like Crossville, Tennessee, or Hereford, Texas, the unthinkable became the ordinary. The enemy, working fields, building roads, and yes, sometimes, attending church. The sheer scale of this presence, largely forgotten today, presented a profound challenge to a nation at war. How do you reconcile the visceral hatred demanded by conflict with the undeniable humanity standing before you? This wasn't a philosophical debate for academics. This was happening in the pews, at the grocery store, through the barbed wire fences. It was a lived contradiction that forced people to confront their deepest assumptions. The first few weeks were a delicate dance, cautious acceptance on both sides. The guards watched. The townspeople whispered. The German soldiers observed, trying to decipher the true intentions behind such an extraordinary gesture. Was it a trick? A subtle form of propaganda? Or was it something else entirely? Something far more profound than strategy or politics? The local pastors, often the driving force behind these invitations, spoke of a higher calling, a universal truth that transcended the uniforms of war. They preached of peace, of love, of recognizing the divine spark in every human being. For many, this was a radical interpretation of their faith, a direct challenge to the prevailing sentiment of retribution. And yet, it resonated. It tapped into a fundamental desire for connection, even in the darkest of times. If this seemed impossible, wait for what came next. The initial shock gave way to something even more startling. Small acts of kindness, a shared smile, a quiet nod. These weren't grand gestures, but tiny fissures appearing in the wall of animosity. The seeds of an unexpected understanding were being sown, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet sanctity of American churches. And then, in a matter of seconds, everything shifted. The air in those churches, once thick with apprehension, slowly began to thin. The hushed murmurs didn't vanish, but their tone changed. They weren't whispers of suspicion anymore, but of quiet observation. For the German soldiers, the initial bewilderment gave way to a cautious curiosity. They had been prepared for anything but this. Not sermons of peace, not hymns sung in a language they barely understood, yet whose melodies resonated with echoes of home. Imagine the subtle shifts. A glance held a fraction of a second longer, devoid of malice. A shared hymnal, a tentative turning of pages. The sheer audacity of the gesture, the invitation, began to chip away at their hardened defenses. They were the enemy, yes, but here, in these sacred spaces, they were also guests. And the Americans, seeing these young men, often gaunt, often lost, began to see past the uniform. They saw the human beneath. This wasn't a sudden, revolutionary love. It was a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of ingrained hatred. It happened in the quiet moments. A farmer, whose own son was fighting in the Pacific, watched a German POW in a work detail meticulously repair a broken fence. He saw not an enemy combatant, but a skilled craftsman, a young man who knew how to work with his hands. That single observation, seemingly insignificant, sparked a flicker of recognition. The local communities, initially gripped by fear and suspicion, found themselves caught in a profound moral quandary. How do you demonize someone who shares your hymn book? How do you hate the young man who waves politely from the camp fence, or who helps bring in the harvest during a labor shortage? The data of war, the casualty reports, the propaganda, painted a clear picture. But the reality standing right there defied it. This was the binary contrast playing out in real time. The abstract enemy versus the undeniable human. This phenomenon was not isolated. Across 46 states and nearly 500 camps, similar stories began to unfold. From the dusty fields of Texas to the quiet towns of Michigan, the presence of these 425,000 German POWs forced a reckoning. It was a silent, internal war being fought in the hearts and minds of ordinary Americans. The enemy was no longer a faceless, distant threat. He was Private Muller, who spoke a broken English and loved to sing. He was Corporal Schmidt, who sketched portraits of local children with surprising talent. The invitations to church expanded. Some towns even allowed the POWs under guard to assist with community projects. They harvested crops when labor was scarce. They built roads. They worked in local factories. For many, this was a practical necessity, but for others, it became another avenue for unexpected connection. The barbed wire fences, while physically confining, couldn't contain the burgeoning sense of shared humanity. What happens next changes everything, because the implications of these interactions were immense. These were not just isolated acts of kindness. They were a direct challenge to the very fabric of wartime ideology. How could you maintain the necessary animosity for war when you had broken bread or shared a prayer with the very people you were fighting? The government, initially wary, found itself in a delicate balance. They needed to maintain security, but they also recognized the potential for these interactions to foster a different kind of understanding. The emotional arc began to shift from skepticism to a hesitant awe. Awe not for the grand gestures, but for the resilience of the human spirit. for the ability of faith and simple decency to penetrate the thickest walls of hatred. It was a revelation unfolding in slow motion, a quiet revolution in the heartland. Imagine a small-town pastor standing before his congregation, urging them not to forget their faith's core tenets, even in war. His words, once perhaps seen as naive, now carried a profound, almost dangerous weight. And the German soldiers? Many, disillusioned by the war and the collapsing Nazi regime, found in these American towns a stark contrast to the world they had left behind. They found kindness where they expected cruelty. They found respect where they anticipated contempt. For some, it was the first time they truly questioned the propaganda they had been fed. The belief in a monolithic evil enemy began to crumble under the weight of countless small human interactions. This was not just about survival. It was about an unexpected rediscovery of dignity. The tension wasn't just between nations anymore. It was internal. It was the tension between what was taught and what was experienced. It was the clash between a necessary wartime narrative and the undeniable messy truth of human connection. The stakes were no longer just victory or defeat on distant battlefields. They were the very soul of a nation, grappling with its own values in the face of an unprecedented situation. The next detail would change everything. The next detail would change everything. It wasn't just about sharing a pew. It was about shared glances that lingered a moment too long, revealing not malice but a profound, shared weariness. It was about the hesitant conversations that began outside the church doors, under the watchful eyes of guards, yet entirely human. A German soldier, Private Klaus Richter, once spoke of seeing an American woman cry during a sermon, her tears not for a fallen hero, but for the universal suffering of war. He saw his own mother in her face. That single image, he later recalled, shattered something inside him. This was the raw, undeniable truth unfolding. The enemy wasn't a faceless monster anymore. He was a young man with a mother, with fears, with a story. And for the Americans, the abstract Nazi dissolved into a human being who hummed a familiar Christmas carol, or whose hands, calloused from war, were now carefully tending a local farm's crops. The cognitive dissonance was immense, a constant low-level hum beneath the surface of daily life. Consider the letters. Countless letters sent home from these POWs. Not all of them were censored. Many spoke of the unexpected kindness, the decency. They described American towns that offered not scorn, but a glimpse of shared humanity. Imagine the impact on soldiers still fighting on the Eastern Front, receiving a letter from a captured comrade describing a Sunday service in Kansas, a shared meal in Alabama. It wasn't just morale. It was a quiet, insidious erosion of the very ideology they were fighting for. The stakes escalated. It wasn't just about individual forgiveness. It was about the very foundation of hatred being challenged. How do you maintain the necessary dehumanization of war when the enemy helps your neighbor mend a roof or shares a laugh over a broken English joke? The government was careful. They knew the propaganda was vital. But what do you do when reality itself becomes a counter-narrative, whispered from town to town, camp to camp? This wasn't a sudden ideological collapse. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling. For many German soldiers, the constant stream of Nazi propaganda, once an unshakable truth, began to feel hollow, distant, even cruel. They were told of an America consumed by hatred, a land of decadence and moral decay. Instead, they found communities grappling with their own pain, yet extending an olive branch. They found people who, despite everything, chose compassion. A young German corporal captured in North Africa wrote in his diary, "They preach of enemies, but here they show us only men." This simple sentence, scrawled in a hidden notebook, encapsulated the profound shift. The belief that they were fighting for a righteous cause against an inherently evil foe began to fracture. The enemy was no longer monolithic. The enemy was complex. The enemy was sometimes kind. And for the Americans, the challenge was equally profound. Patriotism demanded unwavering resolve against the enemy, yet their faith, their inherent decency, pulled them in another direction. The lines blurred. The moral clarity of wartime propaganda began to fog. It forced a deeply uncomfortable question. Could a nation be at war with a people, yet still find common ground with individuals from that very nation? This ideological break wasn't broadcast on the radio. It wasn't debated in Congress. It happened in the quiet corners of American life, In a shared glance across a church aisle, in a hesitant thank you for a glass of water, in the silent recognition of shared humanity between a farmer and a POW working side by side. It was a testament to the power of personal experience over abstract ideology. The initial skepticism had given way to awe at the sheer audacity of these human connections, awe at the resilience of empathy, awe at the profound, almost revolutionary act of seeing beyond the uniform, beyond the flag, to the human spirit within. It was a revelation, unfolding in the most unexpected places, at the most critical time. But this was only the beginning. The seeds of understanding, once sown, began to grow into something far more complex, something that would transcend the war itself. The consequences of these interactions would reverberate for decades, leaving an indelible mark on individuals and communities alike. The next detail would change everything. The next detail would change everything. The war eventually ended. The guns fell silent across Europe. And then, the trains came again, not bringing the prisoners, but taking them away. Back across the Atlantic, back to a shattered homeland, back to lives irrevocably altered. But these men, these former soldiers of a defeated regime, were not the same men who arrived in America years earlier. They carried something more than just their uniforms and their memories of battle. They carried echoes of kindness, whispers of shared hymns, the indelible mark of human connection forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Imagine the journey home, the ruined cities, the families torn apart, and in their minds, the stark contrast, the devastation of Germany versus the relative peace and unexpected decency they found in small-town America. This wasn't just physical displacement. It was a profound psychological reorientation. They had been taught to hate, to fight for a cause that now lay in ruins. And then, in the heart of the enemy, they found moments of grace. Many of these POWs, once fierce combatants, became unexpected ambassadors, not of a defeated ideology, but of a different kind of truth, a truth about humanity's capacity for empathy, even in war. They returned to a nation grappling with its own guilt and shame, and they spoke of American farmers, of church congregations, of simple acts that defied every propaganda poster, every hateful speech. This was the silent revolution, carried across oceans, whispered in post-war villages. And for the American towns, the camps closed. The barbed wire came down. The German accents faded from the streets, but the memories lingered. The local community had faced the enemy, not on a distant battlefield, but in their pews, in their fields, in their very homes. They had looked into the eyes of these young men and seen not just a uniform, but a soul. This experience fundamentally challenged their understanding of conflict, of patriotism, of what it meant to be human. The aftermath wasn't about forgetting the war. It was about remembering it differently. It was about the realization that hatred, while a potent weapon, could not entirely extinguish the light of human connection. The questions lingered. How could we have hated them so fiercely when we broke bread with them? How could we demonize those we saw sing our hymns? This wasn't a comfortable truth. It was a messy, complicated legacy. Decades later, the true impact began to surface. Stories emerged. Former POWs, now elderly men, began to travel back to Kansas, back to Texas, back to the small towns that had once held them captive, but had also offered them an unexpected glimpse of humanity. They sought out the families, the pastors, the children they had sketched. These reunions were not about revisiting old wounds, but about acknowledging an extraordinary chapter of shared history. One former POW, Hans Schmidt, returned to Hereford, Texas in the 1980s. He found the daughter of the farmer he had worked for. He remembered her as a little girl who would bring him water in the fields. He told her with tears in his eyes, "Your father taught me what true kindness was. He showed me that not all Americans were the monsters our leaders said they were." That single testimony, echoed by hundreds, revealed the profound, lasting power of those wartime interactions. The ideological break was complete, not just for the individual soldiers, but for the narrative of the war itself. It exposed the limitations of propaganda, the fragility of manufactured hatred when confronted with direct personal experience. It wasn't about justifying the Nazi regime or absolving its crimes. It was about recognizing the humanity of those caught within its machinery and the radical empathy shown by those on the other side. This wasn't a universal story, of course. There were still resentments, still fears. Some communities never truly embraced the POWs, But the fact that these moments of connection happened at all, on such a massive scale, in the crucible of global conflict, remains astonishing. It stands as a testament to the quiet courage of ordinary people who chose to look beyond the uniform, beyond the enemy. The legacy wasn't just about individual stories. It was about a collective memory, slowly surfacing, of a time when America wrestled with the true meaning of its values. It asked, can we be a nation at war yet still uphold the principles of compassion and decency for those we fight? The answer, found in those small-town churches, in those shared fields, was a resounding, complex yes. And then, in a matter of seconds, everything shifted. The perspective widened. This wasn't just an American story or a German story. It was a human story. A story of how, even when the world is tearing itself apart, the fundamental human need for connection, for understanding, can break through. It's a story that reminds us of the profound responsibility that comes with power and the quiet heroism of choosing empathy. The emotional arc, once tense and skeptical, had grown into awe. Now it moved toward a reflective catharsis. A release from the simple binaries of good and evil, replaced by a deeper, more nuanced understanding of human nature under duress. It was a difficult revelation, but an essential one. It forced us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the enemy is often just another human being, caught in the same storm. This forgotten chapter of history isn't just a curiosity. It's a mirror. It reflects our own capacity for both division and unity. It challenges us to question our narratives, to look beyond the headlines, and to seek out the human stories that often lie hidden beneath the grand narratives of conflict. What if the most powerful weapon against hatred isn't force, but an invitation? What if the greatest victory isn't on the battlefield, but in the heart? What if the most powerful weapon against hatred isn't force, but an invitation? What if the greatest victory isn't on the battlefield, but in the heart? These aren't simple rhetorical questions. They are the profound, unsettling legacy of a forgotten chapter. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about the nature of conflict, and about the enduring, almost inconvenient power of human connection. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a brutal, global war. The men in those churches, both American and German, carried immense burdens: grief, fear, propaganda. Yet in those moments, a different choice was made. A choice to see beyond the uniform. A choice to extend a hand, however hesitantly, across an ideological abyss. That choice, multiplied by thousands of interactions, created a ripple effect. It challenges our modern narratives. We are taught to simplify, to categorize, to demonize. The enemy is them. They are monolithic. They are evil. But this history reminds us that even in the most extreme circumstances, humanity resists such neat classifications. It stubbornly insists on complexity. It demands that we look closer, listen harder, and question the easy answers. The cost of maintaining hatred is immense. It corrodes the soul, distorts perception, and perpetuates cycles of violence. But the courage required to break that cycle, to offer empathy where retribution is expected, is even greater. It demands a radical faith, not just in a divine power, but in the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of their uniform or their nation's flag. Consider the psychological burden lifted from those POWs. Plucked from a war they were losing, fed propaganda that was crumbling, then shown an unexpected kindness. For many, it wasn't just physical survival. It was the survival of their spirit. They were given a glimpse of a world where their humanity was acknowledged, not just their soldier status. That seed of dignity, planted in a foreign land, would grow. And for the Americans, they had to reconcile their patriotism with their compassion, their duty to fight with their desire to heal. It was a profound internal struggle, played out in countless small towns, in countless individual hearts. They learned that holding on to hatred, even for a justifiable enemy, comes at a cost, and that the capacity for grace, even in wartime, defines a nation's true character. This wasn't about excusing the atrocities of war. It wasn't about forgetting the sacrifices. It was about discovering that the deepest truth often lies beyond the battlefield. It lies in the quiet acts of defiance against division. It lies in the recognition that our shared humanity is a more fundamental truth than any political boundary or wartime ideology. The reverberations of these interactions extended far beyond the war's end. Many of these former POWs, returning to a devastated Germany, carried with them not only the scars of defeat, but also an unexpected understanding of America. They became proponents of reconciliation, often sharing their stories of kindness, challenging the lingering anti-American sentiment in post-war Germany. They were living testimonies to a different possibility. Think about the sheer audacity. In a world consumed by total war, where entire populations were mobilized to despise the enemy, a silent counter-narrative emerged. It was forged in the pews of small churches, in the dust of American fields, in the hesitant smiles exchanged across cultural divides. It was a testament to the fact that even when governments declare war, individuals can still choose peace. This historical chapter isn't just about German POWs in American towns. It's about us. It's about how we navigate our own divisions today. It's about the choices we make when confronted with the other. Do we lean into fear and demonization, or do we search for common ground for shared humanity, however difficult that path may be? The answers are not always clear. The path is rarely easy. But this story offers a powerful blueprint. It shows us that empathy is not weakness. It is a profound strength. It is a revolutionary act. And it reminds us that the true measure of a society, even in its darkest hours, is found not in how fiercely it fights its enemies, but in how it treats its captives. The awe we feel, reflecting on this, is not just for the past. It is for the enduring potential within ourselves. The potential to transcend hatred. The potential to build bridges where walls are expected. The potential to find common spirit even in the face of profound conflict. And then, in a matter of seconds, everything shifted. And then, in a matter of seconds, everything shifted. The lens widened. This wasn't merely a tale of specific men in specific towns during a specific war. It became a profound, unsettling mirror reflecting universal truths about humanity. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the most dangerous battle isn't always on the front lines, but within the human heart, where the lines between us and them are drawn. What if this forgotten chapter holds a secret, a profound truth we desperately need today? We live in an age of echo chambers, of digital divides where the other is often just a caricature on a screen. This story, from the heart of a global war, rips through that comfortable detachment. It forces us to ask, what happens when the enemy isn't just an avatar, but a human being sitting across from you, breathing the same air, sharing the same space? The shift is from historical anecdote to timeless principle. The lesson isn't just about what happened then, but about what can happen now. It's about the deliberate, radical choice to connect, even when every fiber of society screams for division. It's about the audacity of an invitation, a gesture so simple yet so potent it could disarm the very foundations of wartime hatred. Think about the psychological toll of sustained animosity. It doesn't just damage the enemy, it corrodes the soul of the one who hates. These American communities, by extending an olive branch, perhaps unknowingly, safeguarded their own humanity. They chose a path that was harder, less clear-cut, but ultimately more aligned with the deeper values they claimed to uphold. They proved that even in the crucible of conflict, grace was not only possible, but profoundly powerful. This is the legacy that reverberates. It's a challenge to every generation, to every society, to every individual. When faced with the other, with the one deemed enemy, what is our default response? Is it fear? Is it suspicion? Or is there a flicker of courage, a spark of empathy that dares to seek connection? The data of hatred is overwhelming, easily consumed, readily spread. But the data of human connection, though often quieter, slower, is far more enduring. The German POWs, many of whom had been indoctrinated into a brutal ideology, found themselves in a place that defied their training. They were told of an America that was decadent, materialistic, and weak. Instead, they found a resilience rooted in compassion, a strength in shared faith, and a defiance of hatred that was utterly disorienting. For many, it was the beginning of an ideological break that would last a lifetime, reshaping their understanding of the world and their place in it. Imagine the quiet revolution happening within their minds. The propaganda posters, the fervent speeches, the absolute certainty of their cause all began to crumble under the weight of a shared hymn, a kind word, a simple meal. It wasn't about converting them to American ideology. It was about reconnecting them to basic human dignity. It was about showing them that the world was not as black and white, as evil and good, as they had been led to believe. And for the Americans, The revelation was equally profound. They discovered that their enemy was not a monolith, but a collection of individuals, each with their own story, their own fears, their own humanity. This wasn't a comfortable discovery. It complicated everything. It challenged the easy narratives of good versus evil and forced a deeper, more nuanced understanding of conflict itself. It was a testament to the fact that even in war, the human spirit yearns for understanding, for connection, for peace. This story isn't about excusing atrocities or forgetting the sacrifices of war. It's about transcending them. It's about finding the universal threads that bind us, even when governments and ideologies try to tear us apart. It's about the radical notion that empathy is not a weakness, but a profound strength, capable of dismantling the most entrenched walls of animosity. The awe we feel now isn't just for the past, but for the enduring human capacity for good. The catharsis isn't a release from pain, but a release from ignorance. It's the realization that history often holds inconvenient truths, stories that challenge our present-day assumptions. This chapter reminds us that true victory isn't always found on the battlefield, but in the heart, in the quiet acts of courage that defy division. It's a testament to the power of ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, choosing connection over conflict. And the most compelling part? This choice is still available to us today. This is no mere footnote. It's a living question, echoing from those dusty churches into our present. What walls do we build today? What enemies do we construct in our minds, media, in our polarized conversations? This story dares us to look beyond labels, beyond rhetoric, to the human beneath. It challenges the distance we keep from those we are told to fear. The courage of those small-town Americans wasn't about grand gestures. It was the radical act of seeing, listening, offering a seat, a shared hymn, a simple meal. Every instinct, every wartime decree screamed against it. Yet, this wasn't weakness. It was a profound strength. It was the audacity to believe humanity could transcend deep divides. Think about our world now. Fear weaponized, division monetized, the other dehumanized for clicks. This forgotten W2 chapter isn't just nostalgic. It's a stark warning, a hopeful blueprint. True understanding, lasting peace, begins not with treaties, but individual acts of empathy. Our common ground is far more expansive. The German POWs, indoctrinated into Nazism, left carrying something different: disillusionment with hatred, replaced by unexpected respect. Their return to a broken Germany, their testimonies of American kindness, became a quiet force for reconciliation, not about forgiving, but finding shared humanity. This isn't an easy lesson. It asks us to confront biases, comfortable certainties, to consider that our narratives, our divisions might be incomplete. It demands the harder path, connection, dialogue, daring to see the enemy not as caricature, but as person. This radical act of empathy is the true legacy. This radical act of empathy is the true legacy. It's a blueprint etched in time, showing us that even when the world demands hatred, individuals can choose connection. The echoes of those shared hymns, those hesitant conversations, those simple meals, they didn't fade with the armistice. They resonated across oceans, shaping a post-war world in ways history books often overlook. The German POWs, many once fervent believers in a destructive ideology, returned home with a different vision. They carried not just memories of defeat, but also the startling revelation of human kindness. This wasn't about an American victory on the battlefield, but a victory in the moral landscape. They became quiet ambassadors, their experiences sowing seeds of reconciliation in a devastated Germany, challenging the very anti-American sentiment their government had once cultivated. They proved that a shared humanity could transcend the deepest ideological chasms. And for the American communities, they emerged from the war not just victorious, but profoundly transformed. They had faced the enemy face to face, and in doing so discovered a deeper truth about themselves. They learned that compassion was not weakness, but a formidable strength, that their patriotism was not diminished, but enriched by their capacity for grace. This wasn't a comfortable lesson, but an essential one, revealing that true national character is forged not only in conflict, but in the radical choices made in its aftermath. Therefore, this isn't merely a historical account. It's a direct challenge to our present. In an era saturated with division, where the other is often reduced to a label, this story compels us to reconsider. What walls are we building today? What opportunities for connection are we missing, blinded by fear, by rhetoric, by our own echo chambers? The courage shown in those small towns wasn't about grand political statements. It was about the simple, audacious act of seeing another human being. The catharsis we feel isn't just for the past, it's a revelation for the future. It's the profound understanding that the capacity for bridging divides, for choosing empathy over animosity, resides within each of us. This is the enduring truth, that even in the darkest hours, humanity can find a way. It's a testament to the fact that peace begins not with treaties, but with individual choices, with radical acts of kindness that disarm hatred one heart at a time. This forgotten chapter proves that the most powerful weapon against division is the simple, inconvenient, yet utterly transformative power of human connection. And thus, the story concludes, but its message endures. It's a call to look closer, to listen harder, to question the easy narratives. If this journey through a forgotten piece of history resonated with you, if it sparked a new way of thinking about conflict and connection, then share it. Leave a comment below with your reflections. What divisions in our world today could be healed by such radical empathy? And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge perceptions and reveal the incredible, often surprising truths of our past.